Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a yellow Labrador in graphite. Now this portrait was recorded using my older camera setup, so the quality is not the same as my recent tutorials, but it does still show the layering process. Now for this, when we're drawing lighter fur, it's still a matter of putting in our layers. We don't want to be just working with one or two layers because that fur is lighter. And that's something that we can have a real tendency to do when working with lighter fur or even really dark fur. So when we start working on shadows or black fur, sometimes we may have a tendency to just pick our darkest pencil and just put in one layer. The problem with doing that is we really do limit the amount of depth that we're going to be building up in that fur. And as we start working here on the fur of the Labrador, there are many shadows that I'm going to have to add, but look at how many layers I'm going to be putting in. The layers is something that I talk about in all tutorials, both here on YouTube and my in-depth step-by-step real-time tutorials on Patreon. Now before I work on the fur, I will usually start off with the eyes first because I do want to make sure that I've got the expression, the real emotion that stems from the eye captured correctly initially. Once I'm happy with that, that's when I can start working on the fur around the eye. Now I will approach lighter fur slightly differently depending on the reference photo. So if you've got a section of the fur that's particularly bright, maybe it's overexposed, I'm going to allow a lot of the white of the paper to show through. Now in those situations, I won't typically leave all of that paper white. I still want to add a few more details. But if you do have a particularly bright highlight, allow that white paper to work for you. Now as I'm working on this area here, you can see that I'm putting graphite down over the entire paper. There's not one section that I need to allow the white of that paper to show through. So this is where I really recommend to study the reference photo that you're working on and see where is the brightest part of your reference photo, where is the darkest part of your reference photo. Now in terms of this for the Labrador, the darkest part was the nose and the eyes. You can see that from the finished portrait in the corner. And there were a few sections of the fur that were lighter, but they weren't actually white. If you compare that to the background at the top, above his owner and the top of the hair there, you can see just how much of a difference there is between the white of the paper and the fur of the Labrador. So I always do recommend look at that photo as a whole. Where are the brightest highlights? If it's the background and the white of the paper and you've got areas on that lighter fur that look grey in comparison, then you know that graphite has to be applied to all sections of that subject. So in terms of the layering process, now this is something that is demonstrated very clearly, very in-depth in my Patreon tutorials because all of the tutorials there are in real time. I don't speed them up, there are no sections cut out. So I can really explain the technique, how I'm using the pencil, the layering process, the subtraction technique when using erasers. So if that and any of my in-depth tutorials are of interest, I will link my Patreon in the description below. For using the pencils for the layers here, you'll notice that I am working from light to dark for this fur colour. I want to make sure that although there needs to be graphite over the entire section of this portrait, I don't actually want to run the risk of making it too dark because I don't want to then have the aggravation of trying to lift up that graphite to make that fur lighter. Now that being said, if you do make your graphite layer too dark, you can fix it. There's not anything really, apart from spilling something on your portrait or putting a hole through your surface, that you can't fix. But you do want to be a little bit more cautious if you've got a particularly bright section of that portrait, that you do be a bit more cautious with that layering process to make sure that you're not going too dark or too heavy-handed with those first few layers. Now that brings me on to something else, and that is how much pressure you should be applying to your layers. Now, in terms of using graphite, you may often hear the word burnishing. Now, burnishing is when you flatten the tooth of the paper by applying excessive pressure to the pencil. Now, in some situations, depending on the layering effect that you want, you may need to burnish. There are times when that is required. But when we're building up drawing fur here and trying to get maximum depth and realism, we don't want to be burnishing early on because we're going to be flattening the tooth of that paper, which will limit how many layers we can put on top. And again, this is something that I cover in my Patreon tutorials, because during specific layers where the amount of pressure that I'm applying is really important, I do make the use of a putty eraser so I can clearly show how to indent that putty to determine how much pressure I am using on that pencil, so that any members following along to the tutorial can actually physically see that themselves in the own putty erasers that they have. It's a really good technique of judging just how much pressure is being applied to the paper. And it's not until you do that test that you sometimes realise how much excessive pressure we're applying to the pencil without even realising it. Now, something else that I talk about in my in-depth tutorials is the importance of lighting. Now, graphite is a wonderful medium to work with because it teaches us an awful lot about values and noticing how dark your shadows or dark values need to be and how bright your highlights need to be. If colour was the most important thing of any portrait, then graphite would not look realistic, and that couldn't be further from the truth. Graphite can contain some of the most hyper-realistic art that's out there, and there's not an ounce of colour used. So here it's all about our values. Now, as I start working on this side of the dog's face, you can really start to see the importance of that. Because the way that the Labrador is led down, this side of the face is in shadow. So I have to make sure that I'm working with a slightly darker base layer and that I'm building up my layers to eventually get those darker shades. Now, I say eventually because it's still important, as I've mentioned at the beginning of this tutorial, that I don't jump into my darks first. I have to still build up those layers. However, look at how dark my very first layer is here compared to the other side of the face. And this base layer process is something that I do put quite a lot of emphasis on, and you can see that in all of my other graphite tutorials here on YouTube. I've got French Bulldogs, miniature Schnauzers, some horse and cat tutorials in graphite, and the one thing that you'll see there is just how much of the importance of the base layer that I emphasise on each of those tutorials. Now, although of course we're going to be adjusting those layers quite considerably as we build up with our pencils, that very first layer is hinting at where our lights and our darks are. Now, the position of our highlights and shadows is important because they are not random, they follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. If you take the eye area here that I'm currently working on, you can see that highlight above and below the eye itself. Now, they are not random, that's there because the eye socket is over around that eye and then it curves up towards the top surface of the skull, which is the area I'm working on now. So by positioning our highlights and shadows in the right place, we are going to then make that dog look like that pet, which of course is really important, especially when working on pet portraits. If the position of the highlights and shadows is not right, we will then actually change the proportions of that animal, and you can drastically change the shape of the face. Now, you'll notice here at this point, I'm always refining my contrast. And again, contrast is something that I talk about in all tutorials. You want to be making sure that your darks are dark enough and that your highlights are bright enough. This is what's going to make that portrait look three-dimensional. So I really do hope that this tutorial has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I'd be really grateful. And as mentioned, I do offer in-depth tutorials in a range of mediums, graphite, pastels and acrylics on Patreon, and if that's of interest, I'll link my Patreon in the description below. Also linked below is a link to the Patreon library where you can see a full list of all of the tutorials that are immediately available there, so you get an idea of whether or not the content that I've got is of interest. Now, the wonderful thing about Patreon is you can stay for as long as you want, or you can cancel at any time. It's really flexible. So if you've got any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video to YouTube next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.